Our time together here today represents both opportunity and challenge to remember and reflect on a time and place, 1960s Mississippi, and then draw lessons from that history. And also to look inward, asking ourselves questions that I find so powerful, I included them on the back of the programs. Are my thoughts of others based on perception or reality? Are there policies and procedures in place that benefit me but exclude others? Am I willing to have discussion with people who don't look like me, worship like me, or identify like me? Our panelists today represent a range of experience to guide us in this reflection. We're differing races, genders, faiths, professions, and ages. We all grew up and went to school right here in Meridian. Some of us have lived in other parts of the country. What we have in common and what we want to share with you is our passion for bridging those superficial differences that tend to separate us from each other. Since bios are included also in the printed program, instead of doing introductions of that nature, I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves by answering this question. What key moment or event in civil rights movement history or current times stands out for you and speaks to why you're here today? Thank you.
Because if these little innocent girls, who as far as I know had never marched, never spoken an ill word against anyone, could die, then we all needed to stand and do better. So when I was asked to enter Meridian High School in the 12th grade, I never hesitated, because if I could make a difference, I wanted to make a difference. Sometimes it only takes one to do it. I'm here today because I feel I've missed the mark in the past 50 years of telling our story. I'm ashamed of myself because I let the naysayers take that away from me. So many of our black people were jealous, I didn't realize it. But somebody had to step out. And I really didn't at the time. I was a youngster. I had no idea what difference it would make. But I moved, and that was all that was required. So when I've been asked to say something about what happened at Meridian High School, I've been very happy to do so. But I've not done it always. And I find that we've missed the generations down the line, 40 or 50 years, of people who don't even have an idea of what history took place right here in Meridian. It was only 5 of us, girls. That's all. But we made a tremendous difference. And that's why I'm here today, because I think everybody needs to know the story.
Thank you, Sadie. The key event for me was the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, but I felt the impact decades later. It was 1984. I saw a documentary about the march. Though I grew up in Meridian, scarcely 100 miles away, it was unfamiliar history. What I saw reenacted on TV, the danger and brutality, shocked and confused me. Although I was a child at the time, I still wondered how this could have happened without my knowing about it. Two questions formed in my mind. Why didn't I know the history of my childhood? And what might be different if I had known? I shoved these questions aside for years, but never forgot them. In 2000, while visiting back here, I spoke with two of the people that I'd like to recognize today, Bill Reedy and Pearlie Mae Clark. What they told me helped me begin to understand and intensified my curiosity. They were instrumental in the direction my life has taken as a writer and an advocate for the power of story. Over the next 14 years, I interviewed many more people who were part of the movement, some of whom are no longer with us. One who is here today is Faye Inge, one of the Meridian 5 and a Meridian Freedom School student and career educator. Faye and her family shared photos, memories, and support. I'm grateful to all of those people who, mostly patiently but not always, mentored me into awareness. Pearlie could not be here with us today because of illness in her family, but Bill and Faye, if you are here, would you please stand and be recognized? Okay. Well,
I think Mr. Reed is ill.
oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. Well, we recognize you both in spirit, and Faye had big dental work done yesterday, so it may be tough for her too. Ultimately, I realized that everything I'd learned could be shared in novel form as historical fiction, and I wrote The Fog Machine. I'm here today because those initial questions have become new ones. Where and how is the history of the civil rights movement being taught, and what might be different for us all if that answer could be extended? Okay, Eric?
Anytime. That's the one. Anytime the story can be told about the civil rights era, I'm willing to tell it. I've been telling the story pretty much all my life, and certainly in my adulthood. I love sharing the story. And the thing that, when I think about the summer of 1964, I was 7 years old. I was 7 years old, and James Chaney was my neighbor. We lived right here in the community. My father pastored this church, and he was a civil rights leader, then president of the NAACP. And James Chaney, Mickey Swanner, and Andy Goodman had just arrived back into Meridian June 20th, 1964, because they heard about the bombing of the church in Philadelphia. And they had just been over there in Philadelphia earlier doing voter registration drive. And they had dinner in our home that night. And just as I'm standing here talking to you, I was 7 years old, standing in our living room, and I remember them saying the pleasantries good night. And I could watch my mother and father, and I could see James Chaney and Mickey Swanner saying their good nights. And they left that Sunday morning, heading to Philadelphia, never to return. And about 20 years later, my father was just sharing the story at a family gathering. And I remember saying to him, Dad, he told me that he tried to convince them not to go to Philadelphia because he knew the danger more than likely had heard about the KKK having a contract out on Mickey Swan's wife because of him going into Philadelphia, getting blacks registered to vote, and so forth. And so he had tried to probably convince them that when they got back, not to go to Philadelphia. And what I said to my father, but aren't you glad you did not convince them? Because their deaths, they became martyrs. And I count their deaths, that summer of 1964, as one of the most pivotal, important, significant events in American history. It stands with the Revolutionary War that occurred in 1776, right there with the Civil War, right there with the Great Depression, right there with Pearl Harbor. That event, to me, is one of the 10 most important events in American history that began to wake up white America to the plights of the blacks throughout the South, that really began to change what I always would say began to move America more towards that perfect nation that our founding fathers intended when they wrote the Constitution. And so that was the thing that stood out the most for me. I'm pretty sure I attended Freedom School that summer. Don't remember a whole lot about it. I'm pretty sure my brother Richard Porter, who is with us today, he came in from Atlanta. He was a little bit older than I, and he has a lot more memories.
Yeah, I was a little bit older than you, but now I'm young.
You certainly look a lot much younger now. But, and so I tell that story all the time. And I tell it to white folks all the time. Because I believe white folks need to hear. And I say it, believe me, I tell it to blacks as well. But I tell it to anybody who's willing to listen, because I love telling the story about my father, who is certainly one, I consider one of the unsung heroes of the civil rights movement. As there are many and we certainly have one in our audience today, the Reverend Charles Johnson, who's with us, who fought with my father as well. Raise your hand, Reverend Johnson, so they can recognize you. But anyway, that's why I'm here. I love to tell the story, Susan. I love to tell the story about my father. I love to tell the story about how important that moment was. And today, I don't even need to tell you about today's environment. You being here today means a lot, so you understand how important that period was. And hopefully, it will inspire you to know what you still need to do. And I thought about that song as you sang, Will Your Name Be on That Roll? And I thought about the roll that was called out and why their name was on that roll, because they was willing to risk their lives. And so if you really want to see change happen, even change today, you've got to be willing to risk your lives, like Malcolm X, like Dr. King, like James Chaney, like Mickey Swan. They were committed to the movement. They were committed to the change that was needed. And what they were willing to do was lose their lives. That's what we have to do today. I know that sounds pretty bold to say you want to risk to lose your life for the cause, but it's needed. Thank you.
Well, the story of how I got here didn't begin in the 60s. I didn't show up until around the late 90s. But now that I'm here, I'll tell how I did get here. And for me, that started really with the 2008 financial crisis. I was about 10 years old when that took place. And for a 10-year-old, you can't really understand what a subprime mortgage is, let alone the consequences of the lack of public integrity, I think, that led to that situation. And so today I find myself in a different situation where the same types of things are at play, where it's malfeasance and lack of public integrity has led to really just economic dire straits, not just for my family at that time when I was 10 years old, but for thousands of people in Meridian and across Mississippi and other parts of the country today. And really realizing that I was still fortunate throughout all that at least my family had somewhere else to go, and we weren't faced with the reality that other families were, that we didn't have to be homeless when the bank said that they were taking our property. But I realized that minority communities have faced for generations redlining and predatory banking practices, and it's been an uphill battle for financial security and home ownership for generations, and that the responsibility in elected officials and leaders and activists and voters and the public is to recognize that these problems still exist today and look at new and innovative ways to address those challenges. Because even considering the wake of the financial crisis, we still haven't even addressed many of the problems. And so while that was, for me, just what began to pique my interest in politics and come to some understanding of what took place, today I'm still going down this journey of figuring out what are these innovative solutions. And I think that when you look at how to address discrimination and predatory practices, you have to begin by looking at things like public land trusts, where we can actually make home ownership a reality for people in Meridian and elsewhere. And you have to look at ways to curb those discriminatory practices. And we're going to talk about prejudice and so much more today. And I think that this all really ties into Meridian's history then and now, and really the history that's been across the United States for so long now. And I'm looking forward to addressing some of these challenges as we continue the conversation.
Thank you. There are a few others I would like to recognize, though they cannot be with us today. Jackie Reed Cockfield was a Freedom School student who went on to become Meridian's first Black commissioner. Through Jackie and Mark Levy, whose photos you're enjoying today, who was principal of the Meridian Freedom School, I learned a story about the Anonymous Lunch Ladies, a secret committee formed by the legendary Polly Heidelberg. In May 1964, Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE representatives, probably Matt Suarez and Nikki Schwerner, stood up in one of the Black churches to talk about housing the soon-to-be arriving Freedom Summer volunteers, explaining that they could not stay in motels or any of the normal options. No one said a word. Then the pastor appealed to the congregation. No one said a word. Polly Heidelberg even stood up and spoke, and amazingly, again, no one said a word. After the service ended, Polly and Desi Turner, whose family was hosting Mark Levy and his wife, planted themselves outside the church next to the pastor. Polly crooked her finger, summoning her friends to come over. She asked what was stopping them from taking a student into their homes. They had many excuses. I'll get fired. My father is sick, and so on. Polly asked them the prototypical organizer's question: if you can't do that, what can you do? A secret committee was born. Each morning, according to some agreed upon schedule, which I'm not sure who actually knew how that worked, women would make food and drop it off with Polly before they went to work. Polly would then deliver it to the Freedom School. I created a character, Grandma Willie, in the fog machine to honor the women who fed the Freedom Summer volunteers. Polly Heidelberg, Jackie Reed Cockfield's mother, and the other anonymous lunch ladies. So now I'd like to move into the questioning of each of the panelists. So let's start by looking at Freedom Summer in Meridian. The American Civil Rights Movement is generally considered to span 1954 to 1968. And Freedom Summer 1964 was a pivotal moment in the movement, designed to bring down Jim Crow in Mississippi, whose implementation of it was considered among the worst. The summer focused on registering African American voters and gaining equal access to quality education. Meridian's Freedom School, which burned and was razed in 2007, was considered the palace of freedom schools. I'll direct this question to Sadie, Eric, and myself. What was life like in the summer of 1964, known as Freedom Summer in Meridian? Sadie.
Well, am I on? Can you all hear me? Freedom Summer was an awakening for Black people of Mississippi, just as it was an awakening for whites in Mississippi. Most of us could not believe that whites were coming to the South to take part in helping to fight for equality. Although these young people were referred to as outside agitators, we knew better. Many of the young people came to Mississippi really not knowing how they would be received, either blacks or whites. But they lived in Black homes, as she just stated, ate Southern cooking in Black homes, taught Black children, and exposed us to realities we had only imagined. As one of those, my mother enrolled us. Now, I can't tell you how or she even found out about the school. I just know she did. And she informed my sister and I that we were going. We walked from 44th Avenue to 31st Avenue to the Baptist Seminary for Freedom School. I eagerly anticipated getting to the school. We were exposed to young white students from all parts of the country who were eager to teach us, to expose us to whites we had not been exposed to, because they were kind, smiling faces, friendly individuals. All whites in Mississippi were not cruel. However, some of the ones that we had been exposed to were. My mom would have some of the young people over for dinner, but she would always make sure that these young people left our house before dark, because the one thing she was afraid of was their safety. I remember several times that she had to admonish one or two of the males and say, just because you're a male doesn't mean anything. You still have to walk through some terrible white neighborhoods, and I need you to leave before dark. The young people would comply, and we had no problems with anything. Now, we did have, at the time, as they said, voter registration. My mom and Mrs. Whitlock from Whitlock's Florist were very, very adamant about getting out, trying to get blacks to register to vote. And the funny thing about that was, even with the freedom schools and all the things that were going on, people would go to register, and either their applications were destroyed or they were told that they did not answer the question properly to the Constitution, so they were not allowed to register. Freedom Summer was probably the highlight of a lot of the lives of the children who attended, because we had quite a few students, most of whom I did not know, because we all came from all over the city. But the exposure that we had to the southern, the workers who came south, was absolutely overwhelming, because these young people were sincere. They wanted to see us do better. They wanted to see all blacks do better. And they were willing to fight and to give their lives. Some did.
I think I get it. Listen, I'll turn it on. Summer of '64, I was actually only 7 years old. And as my brother alluded, yes, he was a little bit older. I'm going to do something a little bit different, Susan. I hope you don't mind. Don't be terribly upset with me. My brother Richard probably knows a lot more of that summer of '64 than I do, and I'm going to ask him to take 1 minute, because he will usually try to take 10 minutes knowing him. Or 5 like me. But there were two things that certainly stood out for me, and it was actually, again, what I shared earlier about the deaths of James Chaney, Mickey Swanner, and Andy Goodman that summer. And the other thing I remember is that Dr. King, it was probably that summer of '64 that he came here and spoke at First Union Baptist Church, kind of as a fundraiser for the Cheney family that summer, and just spoke about their deaths and so forth. But I don't remember participating much in the Freedom School that summer, so I'm going to ask if my brother Richard would just share 1 minute of his memory of that summer of '64.
So, you didn't,
No, I didn't.
you didn't ask me to do this either.
That's what I do.
So, let me ask this question. How many people in here, those of you who were in here from the class of 1970, can you stand up? Class of 1970 from Meridian High School? Can you stand up? Okay. So we're some of the first class where there was this mandatory integration that occurred. So that was 6 years after the summer of '64. So my mother took my sister Shirley and my sister Linda to register for the Chalk, Linda for Chalk Elementary School, which was right up the street, and Shirley for A. Griffin High School, and they were not allowed to register. And then because of that, and this was after the summer of '64, so therefore the summer of '64 was important in terms of bringing attention to the whole situation of African American disenfranchisement in the state of Mississippi and in the South in general. And that summer, what resulted then is people like my mother, and I would imagine Sadie's mother or some other mothers, who went to register their kids at the schools that were right down the street from them, and they were denied that registration. And then they filed suit because they were represented in that to actually be able to register to go to school. Now, the summer of '64, I do remember being there in the Freedom School, and the whole idea behind that was to actually have discussions about what voting and all of those kinds of things. But the reality was, the summer of '64 was not the beginning of anything when it comes to civil rights. It was a culmination of something, because Andy Schwerner, and those folks came in response to a call from African American people who were organizing in Mississippi to get right to vote. And when they saw, as a matter of fact, one of the leaders of that era said, you know what? I think what we need to do is invite our white brethren from the North to come down, the young folk. Because you know what the reality is? If they are seen on television being beaten and shot or whatever, this nation will respond. So the whole strategy was to get people from the North, whites from the North, to come down here and actually expose the situation. And reality is, there were people who lost their lives. But black people have been losing their lives to approach this and to do this for many, many years. And the reality is that those of us who are sitting here in this congregation who were alive and well in 1964, if you think about what you believed at that time, you know that in fact, we probably, if you're white and I'm black, we probably would not have had much interaction with each other. And the beliefs that we had about each other were just phenomenally wrong. And that is the reality that we had experienced in that year.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay.